Hey, this is WWE Hall of Famer from the Legion of Doom, Road War Animal, and you're watching another original wrestling documentary. Oh, what a rush.
He wasn't born into fame, he was born into a pecking order. John Hodger Laurinaitis, middle of three boys, whose last name would eventually echo in stadiums. There's a particular gravity to being the middle child when the eldest becomes an icon. Joe, bigger, louder, instantly marketable, would roar into popular culture as Road Warrior Animal, one half of a tag team so singular that promoters didn't promote over them, they promoted around them. Marcus, the youngest, would wrestle as the Terminator, learning the ropes in the same regional circuits John would grind through. John had to find a narrow path between those poles, the shadow of a legend above him and the urgency of a younger brother behind him. If the family had a language, it was competition softened by loyalty. If it had a rule, it was this: no one rides for free. Family life in that context wasn't a montage of trophies, it was a workshop. The brothers compared grips and argued over leverage the way other kids argued over chores. They spotted for each other in the living room before they ever elbowed someone under lights. Animal's rise heightened the contrast. Joe's success meant wrestling was real, paychecks, travel, a way to turn grit into a living. But it also imposed a ceiling on shortcuts. With a brother so famous, nepotism would always be the accusation if John moved too fast. So he moved deliberately. He became, by temperament and by necessity, a student of the unseen parts of the job: punctuality, conditioning, match structure, and small decisions that turn a card from a poster into a night that actually lands. That orientation guided his entry. Rather than chasing gimmicks out of the gate, John studied fundamentals under Nelson Royal, an old-school hand, prized economy, and ring geography. How to be in the right place so that everyone else can be in the right place. When Johnny Ace debuted in 1986, he didn't arrive as the heir to a myth. He arrived as a worker who could be trusted with the basics. The difference is crucial. Legends are built on moments, careers are built on habits. The first proving ground was Florida Championship Wrestling, then an NWA stronghold where theory turns into muscle memory. Florida didn't care about your last name so much as your ability to do the loop. Drive, lift, wrestle, repeat. The two runs with the NWA Florida tag team titles meant less stardom achieved than trust earned. Title or not, you're doing the towns. You're making time. You're learning which corner of a small building holds sound, which fans you can work on the way to the finish, which referee breathes too loud when he's counting. A parallel apprenticeship looked minor on paper, but major in practice. Flag bearer for the sheep herders, carrying a flag seems ceremonial. In fact, it's a front row seat to the craft of entrance psychology. How a crowd transitions from talking to watching. How heels radiate menace without wasting motion. Following the sheep herders into Jim Crockett Promotions extended that education onto a larger TV footprint. You learn to hit your mark when the red light flips on. You learn that a misjudged glance can undercut a partner's heat. You learn that the guy off camera matters just as much as the one dead center. The first American TV identity push came with the dynamic dudes in WCW, Johnny Ace and Shane Douglas, neon gear and skateboards managed by Jim Cornette, until the famous turn toward the Midnight Express. It was the exposure without morrow. If you grew up in the house of a road warrior, you already understood. A look isn't a role isn't a job. When Ace lost to Mean Mark Callis on Capital Combat in May 1990, it read less like a burial and more like a boundary line. The act had bumped against a ceiling. The question for Laurinaitis became the same question that had always defined him. Where am I useful? The answer wasn't an Atlanta set. It was a Japanese tour bus. All Japan Pro Wrestling under Giant Baba ran on respect, punctuality, and a match philosophy known as King's Road. Incremental escalation, layered selling, finished structures that reward discipline over flash. As AJPW loosened its ties with the NWA around 1990, Laurinaitis made the decision that would recast him. He stayed in Japan and became a fixture. In America, he had been outfitted for pop. In Japan, he was hired for function. The difference showed up quickly. With Kobashi, Dr. Death Steve Williams, and later Bart Gunn, Johnny Ace evolved into a polished tag team specialist with responsibilities that don't live on posters but do live in office notebooks. Pace the middle of the card so the main event can breathe. Help the right guy glow. Plug the gap when an injury throws a planned pairing off by 10 minutes. The results were concrete. 2 All-Asia Tag Team Championships, 4 World Star Tag Team Championships, and the New Year's Hardcore Heavyweight Battle Royal on January 2nd, 1991. Critics, too, noticed 2 5-star matches. Wrestling Observer's 1996 Match of the Year and PWA 500 ranking number 77 in 1997, all of which measures something more elusive than fame, reliability at scale. He even touched the summit for a night, challenging Misawa for the Triple Crown on February 28, 1998. He didn't take the belts. He did demonstrate why he had been slotted. When the house is full, the office can trust him to do the job and make the other man's job easier. If tag team work was a ledger, the signature was the move, the Ace Crusher. Laurinaitis credits a spark with Barry Windham during training. However, it crystallized. The result was a cutter that felt modern in AJPW. Sudden, modular, a punctuation you could arrive from a dozen angles. The move traveled. Diamond Dallas Page converted it into the Diamond Cutter. Randy Orton scaled it into the viral shorthand of the RKO. You don't just perform a finish like that. You change match grammar. Its adoption across eras was an accident. The cutter fit into audiences' new appetite for out of nowhere, while still rewarding the invisible scaffolding of positioning and timing. It was a perfect emblem for Johnny Ace himself, built on precise preparation. This is where the family comes back into the frame in a deeper way. In North America, the surname Laurinaitis was already branded by Animal. Face paint, spikes, squash match devastation. You can't out Animal, and promoters didn't want a derivative. What Laurinaitis learned was to differentiate by usefulness. The older brother's fame was a double-edged sword. It opened doors, it closed rooms in a sense that any whiff of favoritism drew locker room side-eye. From the start, he understood the antidote. You're only here because of Joe. Whisper was concrete. Repeatable value. Never miss a flight, never show up out of shape, never melt down when a finish changes at 6:45 p.m. The effect of Animal on John's early career then was paradoxical. It nudged him towards the business and simultaneously forced him to prove he belonged in it without leaning on the family pedestal. When Booker saw his name on a run sheet, expectations spiked in the opposite directions. Either he'd be an instant star, or he'd be exposed as merely the brother. The way out was to become the worker who amplifies rather than imitates. Ace didn't try and replicate Road Warrior's spectacle. He learned how to frame a partner's fire, how to protect Bruiser's aura without turning a match into a stunt show, how to make a near fall breathe. In doing, he made himself indisposable to a style that demanded credibility over charisma. Nor did Animal's halo vanish once John found his lane overseas. It followed him as a constant comparison. In Japan, the Road Warriors had left deep footprints, monsters, and was a known commodity. Johnny Ace's version was different, less about overwhelming force and more about fit. That contrast helped him. He wasn't expected to bowl over Misawa or Kobashi. He was expected to dance with them at the right tempo so the crescendo meant something. Yet the comparison still mattered in the background. When Japanese press or fans heard Laurinaitis, when they saw Ace was a foreigner who respected the house style, who could be slotted into different pairings without wobbling the tour's spine, Animal's image set the outer edge of the silhouette. Ace filled the interior with craft. There's also the way Animal's career shaped the stakes. When your brother is part of a once-in-a-generation act, the industry's appetite for another Laurinaitis headliner is low. The appetite for a trusted Laurinaitis pro is high. John leaned into that market reality. The belts of the AJPW are proof, but the pattern matches more than the hardware. Credible partners, meaningful slots, and the office choosing him when the schedule gets thin and the card needs glue. You can see it with the Williams-Ace pairing. 2 Westerners complementing Japanese main event gravity without eclipsing it. You can see it with the Kobashi-Ace chemistry. One man's righteous blaze, the other's thermostat. Inside the ring, this produced a second education. Long before he ever wore a suit or carried a talent binder, Johnny Ace had to navigate egos, aches, and politics at the human scale. Who needs to shine tonight? Who's nursing a hamstring? who were in the last finish and can therefore absorb this one clean. In America TV years, the dynamic dudes had tried to tell the crowd who he was. In Japan, the crowd told him who he had to be. Dependable, adaptable, a pro's pro. He listened. As the 1990s closed, Laurinaitis approached a natural transition. He had achieved everything his particular lane offered. Titles, resume wins, respect, and a signature move that outlived territories. In June 2000, he retired from the ring. What came next wasn't a nostalgia tour, but a translation. The quiet skills he'd owned as a ring general upscaled into the office. He returned to WCW during its turbulent final stretch, earning credits for stepping into a head booker role during a period when regimes overlapped and authorship muddied. Regardless of who signed which format, what emerged was the truth. The work was recognized. Laurinaitis could manage product, not just minutes. The one-night U.S. title tournament at Crown Lance Storm stood out to fans precisely because it looked like what Ace always valued: coherence, stakes, follow-through. He went from keeping the machine running to helping dismantle it from the inside. When the walls closed in, he did what rats do: scurry for a way to survive, no matter who he had to step on the way, much like his climb up the corporate ladder. When Laurinaitis retired in 2000, he didn't leave wrestling, he shifted it. From respected gaijin in Japan to a headset in WCW, he moved into booking formats and writing finishes. When WWE absorbed WCW in 2001, most of Atlanta's playbook was discarded. Laurinaitis was one of the few carried over, not for star power, but for order. Vince McMahon had visionaries in spades. What he needed was someone who could turn a Wednesday brainstorm into a Monday live broadcast. Johnny Ace could. His first stop in WWE was a producer, then as director of talent relations. The title sounded clerical. In reality, it was a triage and translation. Wrestlers break down, promoters dream up, TV needs to land at 8:57 p.m. Laurinaitis became the bridge. He knew what a finish cost on a body because he had taken it. He knew what a finish earned on a card because he had laid one out. That dual fluency bought him promotions. By 2004, he was a vice president of talent relations, inheriting a desk once occupied by Jim Ross. The optics mattered. JR was the voice of the Attitude Era, beloved by fans and respected by wrestlers. Johnny Ace was not beloved. He was measured. That was both his shield and his curse. The developmental boom magnified this. WWE had outposts in Louisville, Cincinnati, and later Tampa. The job was to staff tomorrow's Raw while keeping today's SmackDown upright. Laurinaitis' signature was breadth over flash. He signed waves of athletes from football, powerlifting, and bodybuilding backgrounds. Some hit: Brock Lesnar, Batista, John Cena. Some missed and were never seen again. But the philosophy was clear: volume, not romance. If 10 athletes walked through the door and 2 stuck, the system worked. For talent, that calculus felt cold. To Ace, it was math. Reliability scaled. Stardom could be hoped for. Depth had to be managed. That detachment crystallized the phrase future endeavored in company emails, termination letters, and eventually WWE.com. Cuts were softened with the boilerplate line: "We wish so-and-so the best in their future endeavors." Laurinaitis' name became shorthand for those calls. Workers dreaded seeing his number light up their phone. Some described him as robotic, others as polite but distant. Always a corporate cadence, never the friend. The irony is, he wasn't necessarily harsher than past gatekeepers. He was simply the one holding the gate during an era when WWE expanded to global dominance and then contracted to protect margins. Mass releases in 2005, 2006, and 2000 all bore his voice. To fans, Johnny Ace had been a tag wrestler. To talent, John Laurinaitis was the man who ended careers before they began. The wellness policy only sharpened those edges. After Eddie Guerrero's death in 2005 and the Benoit tragedy in 2007, WWE enforced stricter drug testing, mandatory evaluations, and suspensions. Laurinaitis' office administered them. Suddenly, the man who once protected partners in All Japan was telling stars he'd be benched for 30 days. Some praised the consistency, others accused him of selective enforcement. Either way, he became the face of politics in a business that hated politics. WWE eventually folded that perception into storylines. In 2011, Laurinaitis appeared on screen as the executive vice president of talent relations and the interim general manager for Raw. The gimmick was simple: a corporate yes man in a suit, hiding behind buzzwords like people power. It worked because it wasn't far from the truth. His monotone delivery, his awkward hand gestures, his reliance on phrases like the WWE Universe, all read as a parody and a reality all at once. Fans booed, not because he was acting, but because he was recognizable. The man who called to end your favorite wrestler's contract was now cutting promos on CM Punk. The detachment of the office became the heat of the character. His feud with Punk in particular illustrated the blurred lines. Punk, the anti-corporate loudmouth, railing against yes men, squaring off with the embodiment of the corporation. The promos wrote themselves because the dynamic was already real. Laurinaitis didn't have to invent a persona, he just amplified the one that existed backstage. In that sense, people power wasn't just a gimmick. It was an exposure of what wrestling had become, not just a carnival of characters, but a corporation where executives were as visible as wrestlers. So he was a builder or a butcher? The answer depends on who you ask. Randy Orton has credited him with guidance and developmental. Others accused him of stifling creativity by pushing cookie-cutter athletes over unique characters. For every Daniel Bryan who broke through despite the system, there was a dozen names lost. What's clear is that Laurinaitis saw wrestling less as a stage for Mavericks and more as a pipeline to be maintained. He wasn't trying to discover the next Hulk Hogan. He was trying to ensure that next week's Raw had 12 segments filled. In corporate terms, he was risk management. In wrestling terms, he was a man who traded originality for predictability. That predictability carried costs. Talents whispered that he sided with management over performers, always delivering Vince's line instead of advocating for wrestlers' concerns like JR did when he was the one in charge. The perception grew that he climbed ladders by keeping his head down and his bosses happy, even if it meant pushing talent down the rungs in the process. The phrase company man fit like a tailored suit. His critics saw him as a rat who survived every regime change. Bischoff out, Ross out, Stephanie in, Triple H ascendant, always finding a way to remain necessary. His defenders countered that survival itself was proof of skill. In a business where few last decades, Laurinaitis kept a paycheck because he knew how to make himself useful. By the time he was phased out of talent relations in 2012, replaced by Triple H's Performance Center vision, Laurinaitis had become a paradox. He helped populate WWE with one of its steepest roles in history. Cena, Orton, Batista, Brock, Bryan, Punk all came through pipelines he oversaw. Yet he became the symbol of every talent who never made TV. Every phone call that ended a dream, every endeavor that led to indie shows and half-empty gyms. He blurred into his own heel character, the suit who never made decisions without heart. On television, fans booed him. Backstage, workers tolerated him. Upstairs, executives kept him. Because in a business that thrives on spectacle, somebody has to handle the paperwork. By 2012, the office had already shifted beneath Laurinaitis' feet. His last major creative role, Vice President of Talent Relations, was taken from him and reassigned under Triple H's expanding influence. Publicly, it was framed as streamlining. Internally, it was a generational handoff. For more than a decade, Laurinaitis had been the gatekeeper, the man who signed contracts and delivered cuts, the one who set the tone for developmental classes and filtered the communications between locker room and boardroom. But as NXT rose and the Performance Center opened its doors in Orlando, a new philosophy was taking hold. Less about cookie-cutter athletes, more about a blend of independent wrestling credibility and corporate polish. Triple H embodied that shift. Laurinaitis represented the old model. He wasn't gone, not yet. Instead, he was tucked into production roles, backstage agenting, and periodic office assignments that kept him on payroll but out of headlines. His on-screen authority character faded in 2012, replaced by fresher faces. The suit survived, but the spotlight didn't. Laurinaitis still traveled, still appeared in company directories, still sat in meetings, but his presence was no longer central. For years, that became the story. Johnny Ace lingering in the background, not steering the ship, but refusing to be thrown overboard. The locker room saw him differently in these years. Veterans remembered him as a cold executive voice behind mass releases. Rookies knew him mostly as a rumor, the man older talent blamed when opportunities dried up. The new wave of wrestlers coming through NXT, the Sami Zayns, Kevin Owens, Finn Balor's, Bailey's, Charlotte's, and Becky Lynch's. Laurinaitis wasn't the man signing their deals or charting their paths. Triple H and his team carried that authority. Laurinaitis became an office ghost, still visible, still relevant, but increasingly disconnected from the creative lifeblood of the company. And yet he endured. That was always his signature, survival. When Bischoff was out, Laurinaitis stayed. When Ross was out, he stayed. When Stephanie shifted roles, when Triple H expanded power, when regimes reshuffled, he found a way to remain. The whispers about him in the locker room, rat, company man, yes man, weren't just insults. They were acknowledgments of the one truth everyone recognized. Laurinaitis knew how to last. But survival isn't permanence. The 2020s brought a reckoning, not just for WWE, but for the corporate culture that had shielded Laurinaitis for decades. In June 2022, the Wall Street Journal reported that Vince McMahon had authorized millions of dollars in hush money payments to cover up allegations of sexual misconduct. Laurinaitis' name surfaced immediately, not just as an executive, but as a direct participant in some of the allegations. The reporting alleged that women within the company were paid to remain silent about relationships and misconduct involving McMahon and Laurinaitis. The fallout was immediate. WWE announced that Laurinaitis had been placed on administrative leave. Internally, staff and talent whispered what many had long suspected. The corporate yes man had finally been caught standing too close to the fire he had spent years tending. For the first time, his survival instincts failed him, the very skill that defined his career. Proximity to power, loyalty to Vince, willingness to execute uncomfortable tasks became the reason he was expendable. In the optics of crisis management, WWE needed to show accountability. Vince was insulated by his empire. Laurinaitis was not. He was removed quickly, with no on-air goodbye, no farewell announcement, not even the courtesy of the future endeavor line he had delivered to so many others. One day he was on the corporate roster, next day he was gone. The scandal transformed his reputation overnight. To fans, Laurinaitis had always been the faceless executive, the bland authority figure in a suit, the monotone voice of people power. Now he was a headline. For wrestlers, his firing was met with a mixture of happiness and bitterness. Some celebrated his downfall as a justice for years of cuts and cold calls. Others simply shrugged, noting that the office had always eaten its own when convenient. The halls of wrestling history, Laurinaitis had gone from survivor to casualty. And yet the survival instinct flickered one last time. Reports circulated that Laurinaitis was cooperating with investigators, positioning himself as a witness rather than a target. For decades he had been accused of being a rat, climbing ladders not through charisma but through compliance. Now, at the very end, those accusations turned literal. To stay afloat, he provided information. To minimize damage, he pointed the finger higher. It was the purest distillation of his career. When the walls closed in, he found a crack to squeeze through. But cooperation couldn't restore the seat he'd lost. For a man who thrived on being necessary, irrelevance was the harshest exile. By 2023, he was gone from WWE entirely, remembered in corporate memory only as a liability, and in fan memory as a butt of people power clips. For someone who held careers in his hands, the silence was deafening. The irony is that his legacy remains split down the middle. In Japan, he's still remembered as a foreigner who adopted to the King's Road style, who delivered tag classics alongside Williams and Kobashi, who innovated the Ace Crusher, a move that became the DNA of the Diamond Cutter and the RKO. There, his name sits in history books as a reliable hand and a quiet innovator. In America, he's shaded by bureaucracy. He's a future endeavored executive, the yes man who signed bodies in bulk and cut them just as easily. The bland voice of corporate WWE in its most corporate era. The fall doesn't erase the contributions, but it defines the ending. Laurinaitis wasn't fired for poor booking or bad scouting. He was erased by the very system he served. For decades, he embodied the role of a company man, a man who put survival above individuality. But when the company's survival required sacrifice, he was the one offered up. That is where the story of Johnny Ace closes. Not with a triumphant Hall of Fame induction, not with a celebrated farewell tour, not with a glowing documentary about innovation. It ends with silence, from Animal's brother to Gaijin worker to tag specialist to office executive, from people power to public disgrace. The through line is always survival, until survival ran out. In a business that thrives on legends and martyrs, John Laurinaitis became something else. A reminder that constants crack, company men get cut, and rats eventually find themselves cornered.
They call me Ace, watch me rise. With a wink and a smile I mesmerize. In this town of chance I find my grace. In the game of love they call me Ace. Cards on the table, I shuffle fate.